today. It's a great pleasure for me to welcome you all to the second and last day of the Bolivian Conference on Development Economics, the BCDE 2020. I would like to thank all of the organizing institutions that made this conference possible, especially under such unusual circumstances. The Society of Economists of Bolivia, CEBOL, the Bolivian Academy of Economic Sciences, the Universidad Privada Boliviana, the Sustainable Development Solutions Network, SDSN, the Institute of Advanced Development Studies, INESAD, and Fundación Solides. I would also like to highlight the role of Oscar Molina Tejerina, the President of the Society of Economists of Bolivia and Vice President of the Universidad Privada Boliviana, for all the efforts made to consolidate this conference. Yesterday we had a conference that started with Jeffrey Sachs as keynote speaker. We had the launch of the Municipal Atlas of Sustainable Development Goals for Bolivia. We had a special sessions with the World Bank and with the Development Bank of Latin America, CAF. We had informative sessions from Latin American Journal, graduate programs information for the region. And well, we had the parallel sessions that were really engaging, and we had the contribution of the participants was outstanding. Today we have even more. We have amazing keynote speakers. Distinguished Professor Marcelo Olarreaga, who is joining us and is at this moment with us from the University of Geneva in Switzerland, will be shortly providing us a very, very interesting perspective about the relationship between trade and unemployment that will be held through his presentation about the comparative advantage and equilibrium unemployment. Later, we will have a very engaging session too about the discussion about the long-term optimization of COVID-19 strategies. That is quite relevant in the context that we are all living worldwide. In the afternoon, Professor James Robinson from Harvard University will be the keynote speaker, and also we will have our closing session by the end of the afternoon. Of course, we will have our parallel sessions along the day. You can check the sessions and get the Zoom access links through the program. Please check on that. We will please participate in as many sessions possible. Please follow us on social media. You will find the quick links that are provided through Twitter and also through Facebook. And well, on behalf of the conference organizers, I thank all of you who have kindly taken some time of your agendas to participate. We look forward for your constructive contributions, and we truly hope that the Bolivian Conference on Developing Economics, the BCD 2020, will help promoting the discussion around development economics, and we will hope you will engage in these different perspectives and hear about what has been made in this area. So thank you for your attention, and dear Oscar, I give you the floor.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Good morning, everyone. It's my very high honor to behalf of the Bolivian Academy of Economic Science, ABCE, under President Enrique Garcia Ayaviri, to introduce Professor Marcelo Olarreaga. A special mention to Rolando Morales, academic of ABCE, to invite Professor Olarreaga as a keynote speaker in the Bolivian Conference on Development Economics 2020. Marcelo Olarreaga is Professor of Economics at the University of Geneva and Research Fellow at the Center for Economic Policy Research in London. Before joining the University of Geneva, he worked in the research development of the World Bank, as well as in the Economic Research Division of the World Trade Organization. He has been invited professor at CERDI Ferdi, INSEAD, and Sciences Po Paris in France, the Graduate Institute in Switzerland, Institute CLAE, Universidad de la República from Uruguay, and the University of Antwerp in Belgium. He is an expert in active research in international economics. Today, Professor Olarreaga will present the topic related to comparative advantage and equilibrium unemployment. Please use the Q&A section to put your questions to Professor Olarreaga. Marcelo, thank you very much for staying here. You have 35 minutes. Go ahead.
Thank you very much, Fabiola. Thank you very much, Oscar, for the introduction. It's a pleasure and an honor to be here and participate in BCD 2020 virtually. I think it's the first Bolivian Conference on Development Economics that happens virtually. Hopefully the last one. Let me start. So hopefully the last one, so that we can all meet in La Paz. Let me start sharing my screen. Here we go. There you are. Let me start sharing my screen. So the talk I'm going to do today, it's about a topic on which we have been working in the University of Geneva for a while now under a grant from the Swiss Research Foundation. And it looks into the impacts of, the grant look into the impacts of international trade on labor markets in developing countries. And the particular paper I'm going to be talking about here, titled Comparative Advantage and Equilibrium Unemployment, is a joint paper with two colleagues in the University of Geneva, Céline Carrère and Frédéric Robert-Nicou, and a colleague in UNCTAD, in the United Nations UNCTAD, Marco Fugasa. And the basic question, as Fabiola said, that we try to assess in this paper is, what is the impact of international trade on unemployment? And you will agree with me that whether you look into policy discussions or academic literature in economics about the impact of international trade on unemployment, you're going to find very divergent views. There is very little agreement on whether international trade reduces or increases unemployment. So what we do here is that we try to provide a framework that will recognize that ambiguity, and that framework will give a very special role to comparative advantage. And then we'll try to assess empirically whether the framework that we put forward to try to understand the impact of international trade on unemployment can be confirmed in the data. So let me go back to the motivation. Why try to answer this question about the impact of international trade on unemployment? Well, there are different reasons. If you start looking at the if you start looking at policy discussions, and here I'm going to policy discussions in the United States, but I can find you very similar quotes in my country, Uruguay, or in many countries around the world. There is very little consensus about whether trade increases or reduces unemployment. So on top, you have a quote by President Obama in 2015, suggesting that international trade tend to reduce unemployment. So he was talking about the famous or infamous Trans-Pacific Partnership Agreement, to which finally the United States did not participate, but that President Obama pushed during his term. And he's saying the TPP will support 6,500,000 American jobs. So he was suggesting that international trade, the opening of international trade through this trade agreement, was gonna create jobs in the United States. But if we go down a few years and we look at what Senator Obama had to say in 2008 about the impact of trade in unemployment, well, we'll find that Senator Obama thought that trade will lead to increases in unemployment. And the quote says that 1 million jobs have been lost because of NAFTA. So what we try to do in this paper is try to understand which of the two Obamas is right. Is it President Obama or Senator Obama? And not to spoil the end of the paper, the answer is going to be that they potentially can both be right. Now, if you ask economists whether Senator or President Obama is correct, most economists are going to tell you that neither of them are correct. And here I have a quote by Nobel Prize Paul Krugman on his famous AER paper back in the early 90s about what do undergraduates need to know about international trade. And what he says is that it should be possible to emphasize to students that the level of employment is a macroeconomic issue, depending in the long run on the natural rate of unemployment, with microeconomic policies like tariffs that affect different sectors having little net effect on aggregate unemployment. So the basic, or if you want, the benchmark models that international trade economists use to look at the impact of trade on employment, if we go back 10 or 20 years, well, they basically did not allow for any impact on unemployment. The traditional model had labor markets clearing completely, wages adjusting to the clearing of those labor markets. And at the end of the day, there was no impact of international trade on the level of unemployment. This has changed a little bit. And starting with the seminal paper by the Canadian economist Richard Brecher in 1974, international trade economists started finding that, in fact, international trade can have an impact on aggregate unemployment. So in Brecher's paper back in 1974, the idea was very simple. He had an aggregate labor market in which a minimum wage was set. So this minimum wage was set above the equilibrium wage level, implying that there will be unemployment in the labor market due to this minimum wage. And then he looked at what would be the impact of international trade on the level of unemployment in an actual-in model. And what he found is that whether international trade is going to increase or decrease unemployment will critically depend on the relative labor abundance of these countries. If you were in a labor abundant country with a comparative advantage in labor intensive goods, then you will find that opening up to international trade will tend to reduce unemployment. Whereas if you were a capital abundant country, opening up to trade or increasing your trade with your partners will lead to an increase in unemployment. Why? Because you are putting, as you open up to trade in a capital abundant country, you're putting resources into the capital intensive sector and relatively reducing the demand for labor, which will lead to an increase in unemployment. Brecher's idea has been tested many times in the empirical literature and hasn't found much support in the literature. But there is a series of others theoretical papers that have been looking into this question. Davis' paper in the AR looks at whether in a model where there is no reason to trade, or let me put it otherwise, in a model in which the reason to trade is due to differences in the setup in the labor markets in the two countries. So they have two identical countries that open up to trade, two otherwise identical countries that open up to trade. So there will be no trade if they're identical. The only difference is that one has a more restrictive labor policy than the other one, a higher minimum wage, if you want, than the other one. And what they find is that when they open up to trade, the country which has more restrictive labor market is going to suffer an increase in unemployment. It's going to absorb the distortions imposed by the more restrictive labor market. There are a series of other papers. Dood, Mitra, and Rajan show that in a setup that is very similar to us, because we're going to be in a Ricardian setup, that trade tends to reduce unemployment. The reason for that is the basic reason there in their paper, which is a bit different from what we do in our Ricardian setup, is that, as you know, international trade will lead to increases in aggregate productivity in the country, and these increases in aggregate productivity are going to lead to an increase in labor demand, which will reduce unemployment. Other papers, Egger and Craig Mayer and Hellman, Skokie, and Redding have setups where sometimes trade increases unemployment, sometimes trade reduces unemployment. It depends on the parameters of the model. But as Hookman and Winters put it back in 2005, the good news about these theoretical models is that even though they have complex and ambiguous results, and it depends on the parameters, on the assumptions that you're making, they at least admit the possibility that trade could have an impact on the level of employment in a country. So what do we do when theory is messy, when theory doesn't give us very clean answers to the impact of international trade on unemployment? Well, as social scientists, we turn to the empirical evidence and try to see what the evidence tells us about this. And again, this is not very helpful because the empirical evidence on the impact of international trade on unemployment is also all over the place. You have a series of papers suggesting that trade tends to increase unemployment in some countries. So Ann Harrison and Revenga have evidence for Romania, Poland, Czech Republic, and Slovakia. Several papers on Brazil suggesting that in Brazil, trade has led to increases in unemployment, and then evidence by Edwards and Edwards in Chile also suggesting that trade increases unemployment. There is also a series of papers, mostly for OECD countries, suggesting that international trade has no impact. So we're going back to Krugman's world, has no impact on the level of unemployment. And then a series of papers suggesting that international trade tends to reduce unemployment, whether it's Nathanson for Israel or Kie and Hoon for Singapore. So the empirical evidence doesn't allow us for a clear-cut answer that policymakers would like to have in policy discussions about the impact of international trade on unemployment. So what is it that we do in this paper? Well, we're going to develop a theory of trade and unemployment that is going to be sufficiently rich to explain the ambiguity in these empirical results. So we're going to put a framework that is very simple, as you will say. It's based on the notion of comparative advantage. And within this framework, we are going to have that under certain circumstances that we're going to be able to identify quite neatly, we're going to have increases in unemployment when we open up to trade, and under some other circumstances, reductions in unemployment when we open up to trade. We're then going to test the predictions of the models, the conditions under which we should expect increases or decreases in unemployment. And then we look at whether the model and the estimates of the model allow us to explain some of the existing ambiguous results that we have in the literature. So we are going to use a search friction model in the labor market. So the reason why we're going to have unemployment in the labor market is going to be because there are search frictions between workers and firms in the labor market. I'm not going to talk very much about this in the presentation today, but it's not crucial. It's not crucial. The reason for unemployment, whether it's search frictions or whether it is due to minimum wages or labor unions and bargaining over wages between firms and workers, it doesn't matter what the reason for unemployment is. Empirically, our results go through with any rationale behind unemployment in the labor market. So basically what we need is this key one assumption, if you want, that there is unemployment, that what we have, the wage that we observe in the labor market is above the equilibrium wage. And if the wage we observe in the labor market is above, whether it's because there are search costs, screening costs on the side of firms, bargaining, whatever, minimum wages, for whatever reason, when the wage is above the equilibrium wage, we are going to have unemployment. The second key assumption, and this is a very key assumption, an important one in our model that will make things much easier, is that unemployment is sector specific. So we are going to assume that the level of, that there is no aggregate labor market in a country, but that the labor market's clear at the sector level. So the assumption here is that workers decide in which sector there is a shock in the economy. After that shock, workers decide in which sector they're going to be looking for a job. And and that decision is sunk. They cannot change that decision. So the labor market will be determined at the sector level. So here, if we were in La Paz, I can see the hands rising and saying, well, do you have any evidence for this? Why sector level? Well, there is a big literature that started around 2010 on mobility costs across sectors in the labor market that tends to suggest that these mobility costs are quite high, and therefore that labor markets tend to clear at the sector level. So Artuk, Choudhury, and McLaren in the AER in 2010 have this beautiful paper suggesting that the mobility costs across sectors can be several times the annual wages of the workers. Then Artuk, Guido Porto, and Daniel Lederman used the same methodology for several developing countries, and again found the same thing, that the mobility cost can be several times the annual wage of workers, suggesting that it's not as easy as we think. We don't have perfect mobility between sectors. So this unemployment being sector specific will be an important assumption that we absolutely need. Then again, I'm not going to talk very much about the Ricardian model that we're going to be using here today, but in the theoretical part of the paper, we use a Dombusch, Fisher, Samuelson Ricardian model with a continuum of goods. Why do we pick this one? Well, we needed a trade model, and the fact that we have the continuum of goods makes it better for the empirical testing we're going to be doing, where we know that maybe we don't have a continuum of goods, but we definitely have more than two goods in our model. We need more than two goods, as you will see, if we want to estimate anything. But the key assumption behind our result is comparative advantage, is that the rationale for trade is based on the notion of comparative advantage. So it doesn't matter what type of model you will use that will make trade the result of comparative advantage. It can be an extra-lean model or an interquantum Ricardian model. You will have the theoretical and empirical results going through. Two of my co-authors in this paper, Céline Carrère and Fred Robert-Nicou, have written a companion paper with Anna Grujovic, in which they have the same setup in an Eaton-Kortum kind of model, and they look at the impact of not trade, but trade agreements on the level of unemployment. Okay, so those are the key assumptions that we use in the model. What is the bottom line of what we do is that, well, trade is going to have an ambiguous effect on unemployment. So it's not going to be a clear-cut, a yes or no answer that we're going to provide. And whether trade increases or decreases unemployment will depend crucially on the correlation between sector-level labor market frictions. Remember, the labor market's clear at the sector level. And the correlation between these sector-level labor market frictions and comparative advantage are going to be the key determinants of whether international trade is going to lead to an increase or decrease in unemployment. So if you tend to have higher labor market frictions in sectors in which you have a comparative advantage, so if labor market frictions and comparative advantage are positively correlated, then you will tend to observe that trade tends to increase unemployment. Why is that? Well, because when you're opening up to trade, you're going to exploit your comparative advantage. And as you exploit your comparative advantage, you're going to be moving resources towards sectors where there are higher labor market frictions. And these will lead to higher levels of unemployment. If they are negatively correlated, if your comparative advantage is in sectors in which you have low labor market frictions, in which there is low unemployment, then as you open up to trade, you're moving resources towards those sectors with lower labor market frictions, and this is going to lead to reductions in unemployment. So that's the theoretical prediction that we do, and then we take that theoretical prediction to the data, and we find support for for these predictions. So the rest of the talk, I'm gonna not present you the model with the search frictions in the labor market and the Dornbusch-Fisher-Samuelson Ricardian model, but I'm just gonna present you a toy model to show you that this is much general than what we're saying. There's gonna be very little economics in the toy model, but it gives you a sense of how this works. I'm then going to show you the empirical strategy, and I'm going to spend quite a bit of time there, and then present you the results. So in order to understand the mechanisms in this toy model, think of the world as having two types of sectors, rather. Export sectors that are exporting to the rest of the world, and then domestic sectors that are import competing with the rest of the world. We're going to assume that export sectors, the NX, there is a number of export sectors, and those NX export sectors have an average level of unemployment that is noted UX. So that's the UX that you see here is the average level of unemployment that you have in export sectors. And then you have an average level of unemployment in the import competing sectors that is going to be noted UD. As I said earlier, workers, there is a shock, workers deciding which sector they're going to be working, and then they're stuck there because of these huge mobility costs that make it impossible to move away. There's going to be LX workers looking for jobs in the X sector, and there are going to be LD workers looking for job in the D sector. And that's all the notation I need here to give you a sense of what's driving our theoretical results. So if you have full participation of workers in the labor market, meaning that the labor force L, capital L, has to be equal to the amount of people looking for jobs in the export sector and the amount of workers looking for jobs in the import competing sector. So the labor force has to be to the sum of these two terms here in equation 1. If that's the case, then the aggregate level of unemployment in the economy, the overall level of unemployment in the economy, is just going to be a weighted sum of the level of unemployment in the two sectors, in the two types of sectors, the export competing sectors and the import competing sectors. And the weights that you're going to apply to these levels of unemployment in the export and import competing sectors is just the share of the labor force in the import competing sector and the share of the labor force in the export competing sector. Once we have this equation 2, if we totally differentiate equation 2 and we arrange a little bit the equation, nothing fancy, you get this expression here, where the change in aggregate unemployment is going to be given by the difference between the average level of unemployment in the export competing sector and the import competing sector times the change in the labor force in the export competing sector and the change in the number of export competing sectors when you open up to trade. So this is positive. If you open up to trade, you're going to have more export competing sectors. They're going to become relatively more competitive, and the amount of workers moving to export competing sectors is going to increase as you deepen your comparative advantage. So these two terms are positive, which is telling you that the impact of opening up to trade on aggregate unemployment, the sign of that, will depend crucially on the difference between the average level of unemployment in the export sector and the average level of unemployment in the import competing sector. If the average level of unemployment in the export competing sector is higher than the import competing sector, then as you reassign labor towards and resources towards the export competing sectors, you're going to tend to increase the aggregate level of unemployment. On the other hand, if the export competing sector has an average level of unemployment that is below the one in the import competing sector, then this term becomes negative. These two terms here in brackets become negative, and therefore as you reassign resources towards the export competing sector, you're going to tend to decline to observe a decline in unemployment. And then there is the square term, on which I'm not gonna spend much time here, just because of time, that tells you what is the impact of international trade on the overall efficiency in the labor market. So the impact on the average level of unemployment in the export competing sector and the import competing sector. In the empirical section, we are going to be controlling for that by GDP per capita, because theoretically it depends on the overall wage level existing in the economy. So, but I don't want to spend too much time on this. I just want you to focus on this reassignment of resources towards sectors with different level of unemployment. So there you have our prediction that if the export competing sector has a lower level of unemployment and lower level of labor market frictions than the import competing sector, as you open up to trade, you are going to be observing a reduction in unemployment, whereas the opposite is observed if the export competing sector tends to have higher labor market frictions. So now to how are we going to test this prediction? Well, we are going to test it in a very simple framework. We're going to observe aggregate unemployment at the country and year level. And we're going to run these on country and year fixed effects to control for any differences, time invariant differences in labor market institutions or other types of institutions in those countries, any year specific effect, GDP per capita that captures this average level of wages in the country and therefore the efficiency of the labor market. We're going to froze that effect in our analysis. And we're going to concentrate in this term here, in the beta 1 times rho CT. And rho CT, what is rho CT? Well, it's going to be the correlation between comparative advantage and sector level unemployment in each country. And our model, and the toy model, that the version I just gave you, will predict that beta 1 is larger than 0. And therefore, that as you increase the correlation between comparative advantage and sector level labor market frictions, you're going to observe a decline in unemployment. So that's how we're going to test this, and this seems pretty easy. The caveat that we do not observe rho. Rho, again, is the correlation between comparative advantage and sector level labor market frictions. So there is no database available where you're going to be, you will get these correlations. So we'll have to compute these correlations. And in order to compute these correlations, we need two things. We need comparative advantage and then sector level labor market frictions. The first one, comparative advantage, is going to be quite straightforward, and I'm going to tell you in a minute how we do it. The sector level labor market frictions is a little bit trickier. Again, there is no database about sector level labor market frictions that is available. And what we're going to do is try to estimate it using a little bit of modeling and some data. So first, with comparative advantage, how do we measure comparative advantage? Well, we are going to use the approach proposed by the Ricardian approach proposed by Costinot, Donaldson, and Communger, using the gravity model of international trade. So the gravity model, it's the workhorse of international trade. It explains extremely well the bilateral trade patterns across countries. And Costinot, Donaldson, and Communger suggest that one way of identifying comparative advantage using the gravity approach is to try to explain bilateral trade patterns across sectors. So exports of country C from to each of its partners, importing partners in sector S, with fixed effects that are bilateral between the exporting country and the importing partners, fixed effects that are exporting country and sector specific, and fixed effects that are gonna be importing country and sector specific. So I don't want to get into the details of the gravity approach and what each of these fixed effects are controlling for. The one that I'm interested in is this alpha CS, which is the fixed effects that are exporting country and sector varying. So these will capture, if you put a Ricardian setup on top of the gravity approach, this will capture the productivity or the relative productivity of the exporting country in each of these sectors. And we're going to use these estimates after some normalization by the elasticity of substitution that comes from the gravity approach. We're going to use these estimates of the fixed effects that are exporting country and sector specific to construct a measure of comparative advantage in each of the exporting countries in our sample. And we're going to do some robustness of this measure by Costin, Donaldson, and Commanger that has been proposed by Hansen, Lind, and Mundler that takes into account the fact that you have importing countries and sector fixed effects here. So you're going to be dropping one importing sector dummy out of this setup. So you need to normalize the exporting country sector fixed effects to take into account that these dummies are being dropped from the estimation. So we're going to do both. We're going to use the Costin, Donaldson, and Commanger, and then we're going to give you a robustness test with Hansen, Lind, and Mundler's normalization. So measuring comparative advantage is quite straightforward. We actually have done this for those of you who are familiar with Balassa comparative advantage measure. We have used the old Balassa comparative advantage measure, and the results go through without any problem. Now, what is a little bit more tricky is the estimation of the sector level labor market friction. And what we are going to do here is recognize, as we did earlier when I presented you the toy model, is that the aggregate level of unemployment in country C at time t is just the weighted average of the sector level unemployment, and the weights are given by the share of the labor force that is looking for jobs in each of these sectors. So here, the good news is, if we think of aggregate unemployment as being this weighted sum, the good news is that we have this sector level of unemployment that appears here, which is what we're after, which is unobserved. So we can think of estimating this. The problem is that if we wanted to estimate this as it is that the weights is the share of the labor force in each of these sectors looking for employment. And that share is unobservable. So what we're going to do is try to use what we observe, which is the amount of workers in each sector, to come up with a measure of the share of this labor force in looking for jobs in each of the sectors. And how do we do this? Well, we simply recognize that the labor force looking for job in country C at time t in sector S is equal to the number of workers that are employed in country C at time t in sector S, and the number of workers is something that we observe, plus the number of workers who are unemployed in sector S. And what is the number of workers that are unemployed in sector S? Well, is the unemployment rate in sector S times the labor force in sector S. I think there is something in the chat. I'm not sure what I'm supposed to answer right now. Right, please use the Q&A section. Okay. So I hope if it's unclear, don't hesitate to raise questions. So here what we do is simply recognize that the labor force is the amount of workers that are employed and that we observe, plus those that are unemployed that we don't observe, but we know that those that are unemployed is equal to the labor force times the level of unemployment. So we can arrange the first equality here to obtain the term on the right of the second equality, where the labor force is just the observed amount of workers in that sector divided by 1 minus the the level of unemployment in that sector. So we send this term, this labor force term in sector S, we send it to the equation in the previous slide, and we obtain this expression here that allows us to estimate the sector level unemployment. So what is this expression here? This tells you that aggregate unemployment is given by the sum of sector level unemployment times each time the number of workers in each sectors that we observe, again, from UNIDO data. So that's the data comes from UNIDO on the number of workers per sector, and divided by the labor force at the aggregate level. So the labor force at the aggregate level is something that we observe. We could use the labor force at the aggregate level. What we do is that we compute using the same reasoning, the labor force, the total labor force in each country, which is going to be given by the total employment in that country divided by 1 minus the aggregate level of unemployment in that country. So we compute it in the same way as we computed at the sector level for consistency. And once you have done that, you get this expression here where the odd ratio of the aggregate level of unemployment is given by the sum of beta, where beta is the odd ratio of the sector level of unemployment, times the share of employment in every country, the share of employment in every sector, sorry. So the share of employment in each sector we observe, what we are going to be estimating are the betas, which are the sector level unemployment. Now, one important assumption that we do, identifying assumption for this to work the way we're doing it, is that the sector levels of unemployment, as you see, do not vary by country and year. So we are assuming that they are common across countries and year, that they do not vary across countries, that do not vary across year. So this is something that makes many people uncomfortable. And then later on, I'm going to show you, if we have time, I'm going to show you how we relax this assumption and make them country and year specific. But this is the benchmark estimation that we use, where the identifying assumption is that they are common across countries and years. So using simply aggregate unemployment data and share of employment in each sector by country, we estimate this equation 8, and we obtain labor market frictions that, again, are going to be common across countries and years for different sectors. So on top of the table, you have sectors with low labor market frictions. You can interpret those as unemployment rates. So medical precision optical instruments have the lowest unemployment rate at 6.34, but also radio, communication, electronic equipment, machinery and equipment, textiles, rubber, and plastic products are the sectors with the lowest levels of unemployment estimated in our sample. The sectors with the highest level of labor market frictions include electric machinery, leather, basic metals, paper and product metals, and motor vehicles. Now, fine, we estimated these sector level of market frictions. You're going to say, okay, but do they make sense? It is something that when confronted to some external test is making sense. What we did is that we correlated these sector level labor market frictions with the unionization rates that we had available in countries like United States, Canada, UK. We didn't have them for all countries. We had them for, again, United States, Canada, and UK, and we saw whether the correlations tended to be positive. And in general, as you see here, it's not a perfect correlation. Far from it. This is not hard science. It's closer to social science. But you see that there is a positive correlation between the unionization rate. Here, the numbers are for the US, and the sector level labor market frictions that we observe, suggesting that we are going to find higher levels of unemployment in those sectors where unionization tends to be higher. I'm not giving any causality here in this correlation, but they tend to make sense. Okay, so some external tests for our estimates. And then with the estimates of comparative advantage that we use, that we obtain using the Costino-Eyal estimation method, we estimated those comparative advantage by sector for every country, and then we simply compute the correlation that exists between the sector level unemployment and comparative advantage. And here you have a bunch of countries with relatively low correlations. They're all negative, suggesting that if you remember the setup, when you have a negative correlation between comparative advantage and sector level unemployment, when you open up to trade, you're gonna tend to observe a reduction in unemployment. And then you have the top 5 countries in our sample with a positive correlation, which are on average across years, which are Russia, Romania, Cape Verde, Algeria, and Ukraine. These are countries in which opening up to trade is gonna lead to increases, in unemployment. If you ask me where is the correlation for Bolivia, Bolivia tends to have a positive, has a positive and relatively high correlation. It's on the top 3rd countries, suggesting that opening up of Bolivia may lead to increases in unemployment. And here you have the testing of these, where we test whether increases in the correlation between comparative advantage and unemployment tend to lead to increases in unemployment. In the first column, you have our baseline estimate, and forget the first row, which is GDP per capita. So you can think as controlling for the level of development. It has some other meaning in our setup, but you can think of controlling for the level of development, and the more developed is the country, perhaps the more efficient is its labor market, and therefore you will observe lower levels of unemployment. But our coefficient of interest here is in the second row, where we have the correlation between comparative advantage and sector level unemployment. And in the baseline is positive. When we do the normalization of the comparative advantage terms by Hansen, Linder, and Mundler, we also find a positive and statistically significant coefficient. Then in column 3, we said, okay, I may have some questions down the road. The way you estimate the sector level unemployment is a little bit of black magic. So can you show us something a little bit more ground on what we observe? So we simply took the unionization rates per sector as a proxy for the level of unemployment at the sector level. And so we have the unionization rate only for the US that we apply to all countries. Again, this is consistent with the assumption that the sector level unemployment is common across countries. And we find, again, a positive and statistically significant impact. We also, the comparative advantage, our sector level unemployment are measured with error. So we do a rank correlation rather than the values themselves of comparative advantage and sector level unemployment. And we also find a positive coefficient. Because of this measurement error, we do we divide the correlation into quantiles, into 5 quantiles, and we look at the impact of the lowest quantile on unemployment, and we see how the impact of, as we move up the quantiles, as we get to higher correlations between comparative advantage and sector level unemployment, what is the impact on unemployment? And we see that as we move up, unemployment tends to increase. And finally, you have this last column where we control for the average tariff in the country. The idea here, Oscar is telling me that I have 5 minutes left, so it will be perfectly fine. So we control for the average level of protection in the country, because one may think that this correlation between comparative advantage and unemployment may be capturing policy decisions, trade policy decisions. Governments may want to protect sectors with higher levels of unemployment in order to protect labor. We observe that once we control for that, first of all, average tariffs, and this is not a new result, there are many papers in the literature showing this, have no impact on the aggregate level of unemployment, but the correlation still has this positive and statistically significant impact. Then we do a series of robustness tests that I'm only going to talk about the third one, which is probably the more interesting one, which is a placebo test. So the way we calculate the sector level of unemployment, if you remember, uses the information about the aggregate level of unemployment. So one may think that there's something mechanically in what we do that will lead to this positive correlation between the correlation between comparative advantage sector level unemployment and the aggregate level of unemployment. So to try to clear that, what we do is that we assign the aggregate levels of unemployment randomly across countries. And then we perform, so the same methodology, exactly the same methodology. We construct the correlation with comparative advantage, and we see what is the impact of this correlation on the aggregate level of unemployment. If there was something mechanically, you would expect that we'll find the same result. So what we find is that when we do this placebo test and we randomly assign unemployment across countries and years, we find that there is absolutely, so there are 1,000 repetitions here, if I remember well, we find that there is no correlation at all between the correlation and the aggregate level of unemployment. I'm going to skip this as promised. This one problem with what we do and that can bother many of us is this assumption that the sector level unemployment is common across countries and years. We developed a methodology to allow for country differences and year differences and redo the same exercise, and the results go totally through. So I'm not showing you the results, and I'm jumping to the concluding remarks. What we show you is that trade can lead to reallocation effects of workers across sectors that can dampen the real income effects on unemployment. So I haven't talked about the real income effects on unemployment, but in the model we put forward, we still have that international trade, like in most classical trade models, leads to increases in welfare, or at least in real wages, if you want. But the gains can be dampened because there are increases in unemployment. And if you have a different sort of, we don't do it in the paper, but if you think of a utility functions where an Atkinson type utility function where inequality matters, as you increase unemployment, you are creating inequality, because you are creating inequality between those who have a job and those who do not have a job. And if you care about that inequality, very quickly, the real income effects associated with increases in trade, the increases in real income associated with trade can turn negative if you care about this inequality. It's not something that we do in the paper, but it's to give you an idea that this matters. It's not because trade still has a positive impact that it doesn't matter. And this will happen even if trade agreements or the trade reform fully exploits the country comparative advantage and help the country specialize in the sectors in which it has a comparative advantage. So this is important. And whether it will or not will depend crucially on the correlation across sectors between labor market frictions and comparative advantage. The last point that I mentioned at the very beginning is that when you look at our estimates of the correlation between comparative advantage and labor market frictions, whether they're positive or negative, well, those estimates help explain why you observe that in Brazil, opening up to trade leads to an increase in unemployment. Our estimate for the correlation for Brazil is positive, while you observe in Singapore that the impact of trade on unemployment is negative, while the correlation in Singapore tends to be negative. So thank you very much for your time, and I look forward to your questions, suggestions, comments, etc.
Thank you very much, Marcelo. Thank you for your great presentation. We have one question from Pablo Cuba Borda. Will this be consistent with the history of the China shocks effects on USA manufacturing employment?
Yes. So there is in that China effect in the setup is a purely empirical setup. So the conclusion there is that the China shock has reduced employment in the manufacturing sector, employment in general in the US. I thinking about it, so I can't remember right now what is our estimates for the US, whether it's positive or negative, the correlation that we observe. They don't tie their hands there to any particular theoretical explanation. What I would think is that our results will be consistent. The author Don and Hanson results on China will be consistent to what we find here, as long as the US has a positive correlation between comparative advantage and labor market frictions. At the same time, as I said, the way they do it is very different. They have not, their labor markets are not clear at the sector level, but are clear at the county level, so at the metropolitan area level. So the mobility is not allowed in their setup across these metropolitan areas, which is a different way of thinking of how labor markets clear. Both are fine, and both approach would be consistent with what we are doing. So yes, potentially these papers are giving a similar message that there are reasons why trade may lead to increases in unemployment under certain conditions.
Thank you. The relation between trade and the labor market is exciting. No? On the world, at this moment, we can find a debate between, for example, the impact of international trade on employment, wage gaps, poverty, and equality. And of course, he has one relevant because, for example, the Brexit or Donald Trump policies. What do you think about, for example, the postulation that Professor Ha-Hong Chang from Cambridge University that free trade does not make country rich, that don't necessarily true that the international trade, reduce the employment and wage gap in the country, and especially developing countries?
Right. Based on this, on what I presented, I can only agree. So let me put a caveat there. Which is that for me to agree, you would need to have that developing countries tend to have a positive correlation between the sector level unemployment and comparative advantage. Most developing countries in our sample, if you look at our paper, tend to have this positive correlation. As I was saying at the beginning, Bolivia is one country where it's on the top third of countries in terms of this correlation. Now, as you increase unemployment, this will not be always true, but for the level of unemployment that we observe in most countries, as you increase unemployment, you're going to be increasing, as I said earlier, inequality, because in our setup, there are two things that are happening. Those that have a job, their wages are going up because there is you're specialized in sectors in which you have a comparative advantage, and real income goes up. But real income goes up for those that have a job. And then there are those that do not have a job. So you have those that have a job that see their income go up. Those that do not have a job, there are more that become unemployed. And this tends very quickly to lead to increases in inequality. So you have trade leading to higher inequality because it benefits the guys at the top, and it's hurting the poor workers who are losing the jobs. So here we don't have different types of workers. So we don't have skilled and unskilled workers. And I don't want to think on the fly of what will happen if we had them. But we have inequality because we have workers with jobs and workers without jobs. And if trade increases unemployment, you have an increase in inequality. And therefore, a decrease, very quickly a decrease in welfare if you have utility functions that are of the Atkinson type, where you care about that. You don't only care about the average level of income in the country, but you also care about the inequality between these incomes. So what the results in this paper suggest is that prediction that trade can lead to increases in inequality and decreases in welfare in the developing world, and while you observe increases in real income, in the average income, are perfectly consistent. All these things can happen at the same time.
Okay, thank you. We have a political question here. According to your results, how should countries think about free trade agreements?
Okay, so that's a question that I mentioned Celine and Frederic Robert-Nicou with Anya Grujovic addressed in a companion paper to this one. And their simulations are done for US NAFTA and TPP. They were doing this paper while TPP was being discussed on whether it made sense or not, and they did for the US. So clearly, when you think about trade agreements, it will depend on who is your partner. Because your comparative advantage, what will matter there is your comparative advantage, your bilateral comparative advantage with respect to your partner. If your partner has a comparative advantage in sectors that have very low frictions in your country, then you will tend to specialize when you sign the trade agreement in sectors with higher frictions, and this will lead to increases in unemployment. So that is a bit related to what I said at the beginning about Senator and President Obama. Senator Obama was saying that NAFTA has led to increases in unemployment in the US. That is something that Fred, Celine, and Anya confirmed within the setup, so he was not wrong. But that TPP was going to lead to reductions in unemployment. And the reason why, and they also confirmed the second prediction, the reason why these two things can happen for one country, for the United States, is because the comparative advantage of Mexico with respect to the United States is different from the bilateral comparative advantage that TPP countries, that included Mexico, but many other countries, had with the United States. So not all trade agreements are, if you care about unemployment, not all trade agreements are going to help you reduce unemployment. And some may and some may not. And again, our explanation is that this will depend on the correlation between comparative advantage and sector level unemployment.
Thank you. From Nicolas Irasoke, does your model can adjust to productivity shocks like new technologies or something like that?
It can probably, it's an excellent question. It's not one that we thought about it or we tried, but introducing it's a very, very standard. So we basically, our labor market and trade model, no, the trade model, no, but the labor market, it's Skokie and Helpman labor market functioning. And I don't think that it would be too difficult to introduce productivity shocks into the trade model, and into the trade model is trivial, but into the labor market, it should be something that could be done. It's not something that we have done, but I see why the question is interesting. So,
perfect. Once again, Pablo Cuba Borda. How does your measure of labor market friction compares with country sector specific labor wages?
With country sector, those we observe, it's not something that we try. We could try. I don't know, and I'm happy to send to Pablo our estimates of sector year country labor market frictions and sector wages that I'm not sure we have, but they are available in UNIDO. I would be interested in knowing, I know this is a little bit more difficult than when we are in the room, but I would be interested in knowing why Pablo is asking that question.
Okay, thank you. The last question for, I can see the name, complete name. What will be your opinion about our bilateral trade relation between Bolivia and China?
So based on the model, I will need to look at the bilateral. So it's, again, so it's very difficult, I think, to answer those questions without, if I believe in our paper, it's very difficult to answer that question out of the blue. I need to know a little bit more about the structure of the Bolivian economy and the structure of the Chinese economy, and whether opening up to trade with China will push Bolivia into sectors in which there is more or less labor market frictions. So I have those estimates for Bolivia, of the sector labor market frictions for Bolivia. I will need to know how they correlate with the comparative advantage of China. And if these sector labor market frictions in Bolivia positively correlate with the comparative advantage of China, then this would be bad news for a China-Bolivia free trade agreement. If they negatively correlate, this would be excellent news if you care about unemployment. Again, unemployment is not the only thing that policymakers should care about. It's one issue, and real incomes matter, and so the inequality matters. So there are different dimensions in which you should be answering that questions about trade agreement. But if you care about unemployment, to answer that question, there is a very simple thing to do that I haven't done, so I cannot answer, is to correlate the sector level market frictions that we have with the comparative advantage of China.
Marcelo, thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you everyone to stay in this session. Please invite us to join in the next session. Thank you very much, and next soon. Bye-bye.
Thank you to everyone. Great question. Thank you, Oscar. Thank you, Fabiola. It was a pleasure to be here.
Thank you. Thank you,
Marcelo.
Thank you.
Listo, Fabiola, súper. La cerramos.